Welcome to Data Collection and Survey Questions. Broadly speaking, we can contact participants on multiple occasions. It's a good idea to do so, such as sending a letter in advance to notify them a couple days before they receive the questionnaire, thanking them, and then sending a replacement questionnaire with a revised letter for people who have not responded. These stages may vary in their timing. It's also a good idea to vary the mode of contact. For example, if you have a web-based questionnaire primarily, you might try a paper-pencil questionnaire for the replacement version. And speaking of modes, we can categorize modes according to who completes the instrument physically. Is it the participant? If so, we have a self-administered study. Is it an interviewer? In which case we have an interviewer-administered study. I expect that you will likely do a self-administered study. The two most common options there are paper and pencil or electronic. Interviewer-administered studies are most often face-to-face or phone. It is possible to cross the mode with the administration. One example would be a face-to-face interview where you might have a paper-pencil component, either for sensitive questions or for people who might need to look up records such as tax forms. But for the most part, I imagine you will create paper and pencil or electronic primary mode for this study. So far, I have interchanged the word instrument and questionnaires. I will likely continue to do that. What we need to pay attention to is if we have the word test in front of instruments, in which case we are talking about comparing individual people to a particular criterion or norm. That distinguishes a purpose different than a survey questionnaire where we seek to generalize from a sample to a population. I've included a couple test links at the bottom if you want to see those. Tests are often used repeatedly, and survey questionnaires are often created from scratch. You can apply what you are learning in this class about survey questionnaires to test instruments. The world of, let me go back for a minute. The world of survey science has done more to focus on development of instruments, and psychometricians have done more to focus on the analysis of instruments. If we reuse an instrument, we need to be aware that validity is not an inherent aspect of an instrument. Validity relates to how well an instrument fits the context in which it is used. So, one thing you may need to start by asking if you are considering an existing instrument is whether your definition of constructs is similar to the original definitions. You want to define your constructs before you decide to use the other instrument. Then look at the previous researchers' definitions for comparison. You also need to revise an instrument more often than not. There may be items that are less relevant for your context, or you may need to add items. We also need to pre-test our studies even when it's a pre-existing instrument. And then last but not least, we need to consider copyrights by contacting the publisher of the existing study. So I talk about this because in the future you may want to borrow question items or question instruments. For this course, I prefer that you develop your own questions because I want you to see what the process of developing questions is like. That will enable you in the future to evaluate instruments better. What I have set as a requirement in the final rubric for the final questionnaire is that you need at least 10 questions that you have developed from scratch. If you want to borrow a couple of questions from elsewhere, then include a document in your final portfolio that says which questions you have borrowed and where you borrowed them from. Also, give the wording of the question stem and the response options in that document. By the way, when I say you need at least 10 questions from scratch, most of you will have more than 10 questions. You may have many more than 10 questions, but that is a minimum that I'm saying I want. The number really depends on your constructs and how many variables you've defined and so on. Questions are challenging to ask. They can relate to attitudes, they can relate to knowledge, behavior, or sensitive topics. An example of an attitude question could be, is there anything about Hillary Clinton that might make you vote against her? A knowledge question might ask, how is AIDS transmitted? This is a good example of what often happens. It's not a problem, we just need to be aware of it, that we intend to ask a knowledge question, but participants describe part knowledge and part opinion. As long as we are aware of that and articulate that when we report our findings, that's fine. Behavior questions. Did you vote in the 2012 presidential election? And then a sensitive question could be, have you ever filed bankruptcy? What is a sensitive question is going to vary according to your population and individual participants. On this page, I have italicized a particular word in each question that causes a problem for the question as a whole. Do you agree or disagree with the behavior policies of Nebraska's failing schools? Let's just omit the word failing and say, do you agree or disagree with the behavior policies of Nebraska schools? Because we don't want to give an opinion or a judgment to our participants. Do you agree or disagree that the Nebraska 8th grade math curriculum is too test-oriented and that it puts too much pressure on students? This is a common problem. The question asks two questions at once. It's easy to solve by asking two questions. Do you agree or disagree that the Nebraska 8th grade math curriculum is too test-oriented? Question mark. Do you agree or disagree that the Nebraska 8th grade math curriculum puts too much pressure on students? Question mark. To what extent has disability changed your views about friendship? Here we really don't know enough about the researcher's intention with the word disability. It's possible that we could know more if we had the context of the instrument, but even so, we would still need at least a couple more words in this sentence to know what it's about. Do you agree or disagree that disrespectful students should be given after-school detention? Simply omitting the word disrespectful changes it to a neutral question. Do you agree or disagree that students should be given after-school detention? And a word about what I have done on this slide. In an effort to save space, I have asked several questions. Do you agree or disagree? In reality, I would be better off saying, to what extent do you agree or disagree with XYZ? Because most likely, I'm going to have more than two response options. I'm going to have strongly somewhat agree, somewhat strongly disagree, at least. Here's a question that is fine in and of itself. How many children have you given birth to? What we need to check is the context in which this question is asked. Have we previously asked a question about, are you male or female? Do we already know that, possibly from our sample frame? If we have asked it prior to this question, then we can exclude people who are male. I usually prefer gender identity to sex questions, but in this case, we do need to know sex in order to know who to ask this question. In a web-based question, it would not matter where prior to this question we had asked male or female, or even if it was part of the sample information, because web-based instruments allow us to program off of information anywhere prior to this point. Paper pencil questionnaires would need to ask the question immediately before a set of questions that's going to be asked of that group. So in this case, if we have a set of questions about women only, we would ask the sex question immediately prior to this question. Probably a paper pencil questionnaire would not replace the need to ask the sex question, even if we know from the sampling what the sex is, because if the study includes men and women, there's no way to automatically exclude them in paper pencil. If we know that the whole questionnaire is going to a woman, and we know that in advance from our sample frame, then it's no problem. We can skip the sex question. And finally, we want to include an additional comments question. At the end of the questionnaire, that will put the participant at ease, being able to express themselves will help them think positively about the study and will help them think positively about surveys in general. Okay, that's it for the slides. This week you are going to write your question sentences, the question wording, which we call question stems. You're welcome to also include some or all of the response options, if that makes sense to you as you go along. But in terms of what's required for this week, you need a list of your question items. It does not matter yet if they are in order or not. That's another thing it's optional for you to start working on. We will, starting in week 4, write response options and sequence the questions. All right, have a good week, and I look forward to hearing from you during the coming week. Bye-bye.